Today is early February 1st, 2023, for people in the comment sections wondering how it's already February 1st here. I am based in Bangkok, Thailand. It is +7 GMT. I want to talk about the situation in Ukraine, Russia's ongoing military operations in and around Ukraine. I want to show you the map, recap very quickly what's going on the ground. This is from liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. I've talked about how the front toward Kherson city, this is secure. This is a river, the Dnieper River. Ukrainian forces are not going to be able to cross that easily. Zaporozhye, there had been fighting. Don't really hear that much about it, at least not on this pro-Ukrainian map, but they do admit that Russia is making progress toward Vuhledar. There's pressure on Vuhledar. And I want to refresh everyone's memory regarding this situation in Bakhmut, the city in the east, and between Avdiivka, outside Donetsk city here, where Ukrainian forces have been shelling the civilian population of Donetsk city for years. Bakhmut, Soledar, which is now under Russian control, and Seversk. This makes up the last massive main defense line in the east for Ukraine. This is a defense line that they have built up over the last 8 years, and these cities have been fortified. Every building, every structure has been transformed into a fortress, and the cities and fortifications in between them and the fortified cities themselves make up an overlapping and layered network of defenses. So Russia punching through this defense line is very significant. Bakhmut is not just some small insignificant city, and we can see how Russian forces are swinging around the north and the south, slowly but surely encircling Bakhmut. And when they come close to these lines of communication, they can use direct and indirect fire to interdict supplies and the movement of troops in and out of Bakhmut. So that is the situation on the ground. Ukraine continues to lose ground. This was after we were told by Western governments and the Western media that the tide has changed in Ukraine's favor. They launched their Kharkov offensive. They took all of this territory in Kharkov. In parentheses, there were no real Russian forces in those areas. They had withdrawn. They had their forces overstretched. They decided to give up that area, and Ukraine simply moved in. The Kherson offensive, they lost brigades and brigades worth of men and equipment, putting pressure on Russian forces on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson city. Russian forces withdrew from Kherson city, their forces intact. The city never came under direct attack by Ukrainian forces on the ground. They were launching rockets, multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, on Kherson city, but there was never any actual fighting in the city itself. Russia made the decision to withdraw. They maintained their fighting capacity, preserved it, while taking out this huge cost on Ukraine. These waves and waves of men and machines that they launched toward Russian defenses, they lost brigades worth. This is why now we're talking about NATO tanks replacing that essentially their entire army's worth of heavy weapons. It's all gone because of those successful offensives. So now we're talking about turning the tide again. And I just want to show you some of the headlines this week in the Western media itself. This is Newsweek. Zelensky tells U.S. to speed up as Russia makes gains in Bakhmut. This is Newsweek. This isn't RT. Here, Reuters. Biden says no F-16s for Ukraine as Russia claims gains. So this is Ukraine asking for even more weapons, and their Western sponsors talking about sending even more weapons, however unrealistic. I'll get into that in just a moment. And then we have this article from CNN. Ukraine is relying on Soviet-era tanks to hold the line until Western reinforcements arrive, which is going to make absolutely no difference. at all. This is what the article says. The question is whether Ukrainian forces can hold their current positions before being reinforced by the arrival of scores of Western tanks, which could take up to 2 months, and in the case of the M1 Abrams, over a year. I will get into that in just a moment too. Scores of tanks, not hundreds of tanks. NATO had been sending Soviet-era tanks to Ukraine by the hundreds, several hundred tanks. Russia has destroyed them. This is why Ukraine is asking for more tanks. The West has no more Soviet-era tanks to transfer to Ukraine, tanks that Ukrainian troops are familiar with, that they can maintain and sustain on the battlefield. They have no more of that left. They are going to send Western main battle tanks. When you read the CNN article, and there's a video that goes along with it, they talk about Challenger 2, British Challenger 2 tanks taking 4 or 5 hits from a T-72 before being knocked out, while being able to destroy a T-72 with a single shot. Totally oblivious to the fact that in this conflict, that represents so-called experts whose only reference point is, say, Desert Storm or the US-British invasion of Iraq in 2003. This current conflict that's taking place actually right now, tanks are not destroying other tanks. Tanks are being destroyed by artillery shells, artillery rockets, and different types of missiles, anti-tank guided missiles, which come in many forms, especially if you're Ukrainian facing the Russian army. They have crews on the ground infantry with portable anti-tank guided missiles, RPGs, modern tandem charge RPGs that can punch a hole through any modern tank. They also have anti-tank guided missiles that can actually be fired out of tanks, Russian tanks. They also have anti-tank guided missiles fired by helicopters and certain warplanes. So these are the many different ways Russia can and has been destroying hundreds of Ukrainian tanks up until now. And then at one point, the article says Ukraine is going to get all of these Western tanks and they're going to use them together with the 1,000 Russian tanks Ukraine already has. And they don't really make it clear what they meant by Russian tanks. Is this just ignorance, conflating the Soviet Union with Russia, these tanks that Ukraine had when they started the conflict out? Are they calling those Russian tanks, or are they claiming that Ukraine has captured 1,000 Russian tanks intact, are operational, and will be able to use alongside with these Western tanks? And if Ukraine, this article makes no sense. If they had 1,000 tanks in their possession, operational, that they could use, what difference would 80 or 100 or 200 or even 300 Western tanks make if you already had 1,000 operational tanks? This is the fantasy world that the Western media is collectively retreating into as things unravel in Ukraine. It's very clear. If you're looking at statements from representatives across Western governments, or you're looking at the Western media, they're desperate to actually turn the tide in Ukraine. I know they've claimed they have already, but obviously they haven't. So they're very desperate to do this. By everyone's account, Ukraine is losing ground. I just showed you the headlines, Western headlines. They are losing Bakhmut. It's being encircled. They have lost Soledar. Russian forces are advancing on Vuhledar in South Donetsk, and Ukraine is unable to stop them. And there appears to be growing awareness that the longer this drags on, the more Ukraine will deteriorate as a nation state, as a government, as an economy, as a society, but also militarily. They will continue to deteriorate. And if you have an army that is battered and deteriorating, no amount of weapons that you send to them can be used effectively. They simply aren't able to organize themselves well enough to do so. And I've explained why many times. On the other hand, Russia continues to consolidate its positions in Ukraine. They have mobilized over 300,000 troops. They are constantly bringing in new equipment. The West, by trying to escalate with Russia, announcing all of these weapons being transferred to Ukraine, especially Leopard tanks, German Leopard tanks. We all know history. World War II, it was German tanks under Nazi Germany, named after big cats, that rolled into Russia, invaded Russia, the Soviet Union, and also Russia, killed millions of people, and this was the Great Patriotic War, fighting back and defeating Nazi Germany. Now you have German tanks, also named after big cats, rolling back onto the battlefield in some place like Ukraine, fighting Russians once again. It's not just bad optics. It is a continuation of the same mindset and the same objective that Nazi Germany had, now manifesting itself across the West today, the United States, NATO, the European Union. This desire to fight Russia, wear Russia down, break Russia up, and subordinate it. This is exactly what Nazi Germany wanted to do. This is openly what the United States and its allies want to do. But it's not just about optics. It is history actually repeating itself here. Each time the West does this, though, they are giving what Mike Jones of I, Earl Grey said in an interview with George Galloway. I'll put the link to that interview in the video description below. He said every time the West escalates, they're giving a political gift to Moscow. In other words, Moscow may have things they want to do to mobilize society, to improve its position in terms of this conflict, but politically they cannot, because they cannot justify putting the public through difficulties without a sufficient pretext. But luckily, the West is supplying Moscow with a steady stream of pretexts that Moscow can use to better mobilize the public and to put Russia into a better position regarding this special military operation. Now, take a look at this Foreign Affairs op-ed, How to Get a Breakthrough in Ukraine. It's by former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. And what he's doing is he's repeating all of these arguments for sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. He talks about sending ATACMS, ballistic missiles, F-16 fighter jets, Gray Eagle drones, and I've explained how in each case Russia will either adapt and overcome or completely neutralize these weapon systems. F-16s, if they're operated by Ukrainians and flown out of Ukraine, they will be destroyed on the ground and shot out of the air, just like the rest of Ukraine's Air Force. And the Gray Eagle drone is no more capable than the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones that Ukraine also had in numbers, which Russia also destroyed both in the air and on the ground. So what is this about? If you're calling for all of these weapons to be sent to Ukraine, even though there's no possibility of them being used effectively against Russia or changing the tide of this conflict, why are you calling for these weapons to be sent? And what he's trying to do is convince Russia that the United States is in this for the long term. Convince Russia that they're in it for the long term, and to make Russia itself question its own resolve in the long term regarding special military operation. And he just hopes that Russia simply does not have the resolve to match and exceed what the US is pledging, what the US and their allies are pledging. And I guess he also hopes that Russia doesn't realize that this is a bluff. And I want to show you this from the US Department of Defense. This is a press briefing held on January 26, 2023, relatively recently. And the media is asking questions because they want to know why these M1 Abrams, what's taking so long? Why aren't you sending more? So here's one of the questions. It says, I'm hoping you can fill in some blanks from yesterday on the tank issue. Now that we're a day out of the announcement, can you give us some better granularity on the training? How soon will it start? When maybe, and will it be done, even if you can't say exactly where you expect it will be done in the continental US? Or, I mean, there are obviously some in Europe that could be used. And so this is what the Pentagon press secretary says. Unfortunately, I think you're going to be a little bit disappointed with my answers today in terms of how soon. I just don't have a timeline for you. We are trying to get the training set up, but as of a timeline, when, where that's going to be, and when, I just don't have the available. I just don't have that available at this moment. And obviously, not liking that answer, there's a follow-up, and they ask, is there a shortage of M1 Abrams tanks? Is that why you're having to go through the procurement process that's not going to allow them to be there until, you know, almost a year's time? Why not just take them off the shelf to get them in the fight sooner? Again, this is the Western media who presumes to explain to the public what's going on in Ukraine, and yet they have absolutely no understanding at all of the subject matter. And the Pentagon spokesperson says, we just don't have these tanks available in excess in our US stocks, which is why it is going to take months to transfer these M1A2 Abrams to Ukraine. And I think that you have to remember, I mean, as you probably know, these tanks are going to require training, maintenance, sustainment that is going to take a very long time to also train the Ukrainians on. Sounds like something I've been saying for a long time. And liking that answer even less, there's yet another follow-up. They ask, what changed from Tuesday to Thursday when here at the podium we heard that the M1 Abrams was too difficult logistically to support? It was the wrong weapon to be sent, and then hearing that the president has authorized 31 to be sent. And so they answer that by saying, well, I don't think that. I would just say that, you know, we stand by the statement that we made from here at the podium and that you've heard Secretary Austin and the chairman say before. These are going to be difficult capabilities to maintain and sustain. We stand by that. There's going to be challenges. And then she also says, giving the Abrams is a long-term show of commitment. And that's the key. Right there, that little sentence is the key to all of this. It is a long-term show of commitment. It is not actual aid that's going to help Ukraine in any practical way. There's no practical way to give them this aid. It is just a show of support. It is for optics only. It's for public relations. It's for diplomatic reasons, and it's also to put diplomatic pressure on Russia. See, all of this aid we're giving to Ukraine, we will never give up, so that's why you should give up first. This is what the US is trying to pull, hoping that Russia doesn't listen to Pentagon press briefings at all and has no idea that this is implausible and impractical and that there's no way for the US to do this. And I've had many people say, well, Brian, what if NATO operators are crewing these tanks? Wouldn't that make a difference? It would make them more effective on the battlefield, but they will still suffer from critical issues such as logistics, which NATO wouldn't be running, the lack of combined arms support, no air power to support these tanks, which is why we're hearing about F-16s. People are starting to realize, well, if you just send the tanks in, aren't they just going to get blown up like all of the other tanks we've sent? Why don't we send in air power? Apparently, forgetting that Ukraine had an air force, Russia was very capable of shooting it down. They will shoot down anything that flies over Ukraine, whether they're F-16s piloted by Ukrainians and somehow flown from airfields in Ukraine, or if they're Polish pilots flying them out of Poland, Russia is going to shoot them down just the same. So what I'm saying here is that without NATO intervening directly and completely and openly, all of this talk about sending more weapons is bluff. The West lacks the military-industrial capacity to create these weapons and the munitions they use in sufficient numbers to match Russia. This is the problem the West has incrementally admitted over the last couple of months regarding artillery, which has been fundamental in this conflict. And now they're starting to admit, and we just saw the Pentagon itself admit that sending these tanks is not simple. We're sending 31 of them. It's a show of commitment. There really is no way for them to effectively use these weapon systems. I've explained it many times. It takes years for a country when they pick a new tank to use for their forces. It takes them usually years to incorporate them, to train everyone up on everything, not just operating the tank itself, operating it together as a tank platoon, as a tank company within a brigade, etc., and also all of the sustainment, logistical supports, operating it in combined arms, and also maintaining it, fixing it. How are you fixing it? All of these things are real details that need to be worked out. It is not an episode of G.I. Joe where Duke just jumps into a tank and goes and fights Cobra Commander. So this is an example of a bluff, sending all of these weapons. Here's another example of a good bluff that the West is trying to use against Russia and this desperate search for leverage against Moscow. From Foreign Policy, why Crimea is not a bridge too far. Withholding support for Ukraine and reclaiming the territory risks undermining gains made thus far. And this is by Michael Allen, a former special assistant to the President George W. Bush, his National Security Council. Someone involved in previous wars of aggression, proxy wars, and campaigns of political sedition all around the globe. This is what he says. He says, while Ukraine still has battles to fight, the West may soon have to decide whether it would support a coming Ukrainian assault on Crimea or insist Ukraine count its blessings and settle for the return of only the territory Russia has captured since its invasion in February 2022. I would insist Ukraine forget about all of this, because they're not going to get either. It also says, of course, the desires of the people living in Crimea matter too, but it is difficult to accurately discern what their preferences might be. Not true, and I'm going to show you in just a moment. A 2014 referendum on the topic was widely considered a sham. Yes, it was considered a sham because that was politically expedient for the West to call it a sham, but in actuality it did reflect how the people in Crimea felt at the time. It continues. Not unlike those, so he's talking about supposedly sham referendums, not unlike those recently staged in Russian-held Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Zaporozhye. This mirage of public opinion is even less reliable considering Russian President Vladimir Putin's subsequent efforts to reshape the population of the peninsula through forced deportations, the persecution of native Tartars, and the imprisonment of political activists. And by that he means US agitators funded by the US government to stir up trouble in Crimea. And all of this is a complete lie. And to refute this lie, I'm going to go to this. Public opinion survey residents of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, May 16th to 30th, 2013, a year before the US-sponsored coup in Kiev. It is conducted by two US organizations, USAID, and also the International Republican Institute, which is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the reason they are conducting this poll is to figure out how best to tailor a campaign of political subversion in Crimea, and I think in a much wider sense across the rest of Ukraine. And let's look at this one more time. Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Even before Russia moved in and the Crimean people voted to join the Russian Federation, after their independent parliament requested Russian troops come in and protect them, in the wake of the US engineered coup in Kiev in 2014, it was an autonomous republic. It had a special status even then within Ukraine because it was recognized that Crimea was not like the rest of Ukraine, very obviously. This is what the poll found. Regardless of your passport, what do you consider yourself? 24% Crimean, 15% Ukrainian, 40% Russian, 15% Crimean Tatar, and 5% other, and 1% not available, don't know. So the largest component here by far is Russian, identifying as Russian. There's another question. If Ukraine was able to enter only one international economic union, which entity should it be with? Only 17% said the European Union, which is actually less than don't know or not applicable. 22% rate here. 8% said other. I don't know what that other would be. And a whopping 53, a majority, 53% says the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. This is a US government poll in 2013, just a year before the US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. They clearly see themselves as Russian and prefer Russia, doing business with Russia, being associated with Russia. So knowing that, seeing that with your own eyes, this claim made by foreign policy, and really when you hear anyone talking about helping Ukraine invade and take over Crimea, they're trying to trample the will of the people that actually live on the peninsula, people who have already chosen their path into the future with the Russian Federation. And this is reflected in even US government polls. I think it's very important to point this out, that this talking point is a lie. And this imperative they think they have to help Ukraine take Crimea has nothing to do with helping the actual people living there. It's simply another way to find some leverage over Russia. If you don't do what we tell you, we will arm Ukraine, we will help them invade and take over Crimea, specifically because they know Crimea is actually Russian, not because they honestly believe it isn't Russian. So this is foreign policy blatantly lying about this. He says, if Russia believed it could lose Crimea to Ukraine on the battlefield, it may be amenable to sincere peace talks. For this reason, at a minimum, the Biden administration must not take Crimea off the table by restricting U.S. military assistance. It's not about actually helping Ukraine take Crimea or any moral argument for doing it. And now that you see there is no moral argument for doing it, quite the opposite, actually, they reveal that this is just another bluff, another threat against Russia to somehow try to get some sort of leverage over Russia. But again, because Crimea is actually Russian, this, above all other reasons, is why Russia will never back down. If you attack Crimea, it will only harden their resolve more. And then the article ends, the Biden administration often cites the rules-based international order as a bedrock principle of the international system, embracing the sovereignty of nations. In September 2022, U.S. President Joe Biden pledged at the United Nations to end the war in Ukraine on just terms, on terms we all signed up for, that you cannot seize a nation's territory by force, unless it's named Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or Syria. Failing to support Ukraine in reclaiming Crimea would not only contradict Biden's pledge, but would also risk undermining the hard-fought gains for peace that have been made thus far. And all he's talking about is all of these weapons and this giant military menace that NATO has created in Ukraine that they are trying to use as leverage against Russia to get Russia to back down. That's all they're talking about. This rules-based international order and this embracing the sovereignty of nations to help an anti-Russian regime in Kiev invade a peninsula where the people have clearly made up their minds that they stand with Russia, that they want to be a part of the Russian Federation. This has nothing to do with rules. This has nothing to do with order. This has nothing to do with sovereignty. This is just the United States trying to find another way to win in Ukraine because they are losing right now. And when you think about it, this is what the United States has been doing throughout the entire 21st century, from the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where they killed 1 million people and counting. Just Iraq alone, predicated on a deliberate lie, that is many times worse than anything the US has even accused Russia of in fiction. Just keep that in mind. And then after Iraq, they helped destroy completely the country of Libya. They have illegally invaded and still to this day occupy eastern Syria. And Russia is reacting to this threat right on its border in Ukraine because it does not want to be the next Iraq or Libya or Syria or Afghanistan. And this is why the West is bent out of shape because someone has finally said no, that has the ability to back it up. So all of this talk about tanks, ATACMS, jets. Let's look at jets. This is from Time Magazine. The next debate over arming Ukraine is here, and it's about fighter jets. And it says, Ukraine currently relies on its Soviet-era fighter jets, which were made before Kiev declared independence from the Soviet Union over 31 years ago. These aircraft have been overpowered by Russia's heavy-duty jets that can fire missiles from a long range without entering Ukrainian airspace. Ukraine's deputy foreign minister has asked allied nations to create a fighter jet alliance to match Russia's supply. This would see Ukraine equipped with F-16s and F-35s and Eurofighters, Tornadoes, as they like to say in the UK, Swedish Griffin jets, and more. Ukraine is also in need of helicopters. The former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko told Euronews, and this is a complete joke, because any one of these aircraft would be a big enough challenge on their own. Sending a whole variety of jets would be impossible. It is logistically impossible to do this. You need to set up infrastructure. You need an airport that Russia isn't just going to immediately attack with cruise missiles. You need infrastructure. You need ground support equipment. You need technicians. You need a whole support crew. You need fuel depots for all the jet fuel, the aviation fuel. You need then to fly these aircraft in an environment where the best anti-aircraft systems in the world are operating. And this is not something that I'm just imagining. This is something that even the article mentions. It says these jets would be at high risk from Russian surface-to-air missiles and therefore would need to fly at low altitudes within several tens of kilometers of the front lines, and actually more, because Russia will shoot them down, because Ukraine had an air force, it has been shot down. And then to build on top of that, let's take a look at this from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It is a U.S. government and U.S. and European arms industry funded think tank. This is their missile defense project. Russian air and missile defense. This was last updated on August 2021. And it says, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union invested heavily in its air defense systems. As a result, Russia now possesses some of the most advanced air and missile defense systems in the world. Russian air defense systems are also highly proliferated and are currently in use by dozens of nations around the world, including in China. And a lot of Chinese integrated air defense systems are based on very successful Russian designs. Current Russian air defense doctrine follows a three-tier approach. This layered system allows Russian air defense forces to create anti-access area denial zones that can be difficult to penetrate. The highest tier of these defensive networks uses long-range systems such as the S-200, S-300, and S-400, providing air defense bubbles potentially up to 800 kilometers in diameter. Just remember, the front line in the Donbas region to the Polish border, that is about 1,000 kilometers, just to give you an idea of what that means. These zones are typically augmented by the second tier, which includes medium-range systems like the Buk and its variants. This medium-range layer is intended to increase radar coverage within the air defense zone and augment the more limited inventories of longer-range interceptor missiles. The third tier uses mobile, short-range systems like the ASA, Nerva, to provide extra protection to key areas such as military bases. These systems, along with highly mobile systems like the Buk, are often also attached to formations of ground forces in the field. Due to their vulnerability to low-flying threats such as cruise missiles, the first and second layer defenses are often guarded by point defense systems like the Tor or Pantsir S-1. And in my video about the Russian Battalion Tactical Group, I showed a video where a Pantsir system shot down HIMARS, these guided rockets that Ukraine has been using. That is how capable they are. They can shoot down HIMARS rockets, they can shoot down drones and aircraft and anything else. So I'm not making this up. This is Western analysts admitting that Russia has the best air defense system in the world. It is tiered, it is networked together, and anything that the US and its allies give Ukraine to fly over Ukraine is going to be shot down. By that alone, saying nothing of the large amount of Russian military aviation being used in the special military operation. So this threat of sending tanks that aren't going to arrive for a year and that they admit are too difficult for Ukraine to use, this threat of helping Ukraine take over Crimea, this threat of sending warplanes, this is all to make Russian policymakers panic, make the Russian population panic. And it's all done in the hopes that the public, policymakers, the Kremlin don't understand how empty a threat this is, how weak this hand is that they're trying to bluff Russia over. They want to make it as if there is a tsunami of military aid flooding into Ukraine that cannot be stopped. Anyone with military knowledge is going to know this is not a tsunami, this is smoke and mirrors. So why is the US trying to use smoke and mirrors to convince Russia that they're in it for the long haul? Why not just demonstrate it for real? Because they cannot, and they are out of time, and this is something that they have been saying in the Western media. So this is from the Washington Post. Opinion: time is not on Ukraine's side. And this is by Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, and Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense during the Bush administration. And it says, both of us have dealt with Putin on a number of occasions, and we are convinced he believes time is on his side, that he can wear down the Ukrainians, and that US and European unity and support for Ukraine will eventually erode and fracture. To be sure, the Russian economy and people will suffer as the war continues, but Russians have endured far worse. For Putin, defeat is not an option. He cannot cede to Ukraine the 4 eastern provinces he has declared part of Russia. If he cannot be military successful this year, he must retain control of positions in eastern and southern Ukraine that provide future jumping off points for renewed offensives to take the rest of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, control the entire Donbas region, and then move west. 8 years separated Russia's seizure of Crimea and its invasion nearly a year ago. Count on Putin to be patient to achieve his destiny. And when they talk about Russia seizing Crimea, well, I just showed you the US government poll the year before that happened, highlighting the fact that the people there identified as Russian, and then we could only imagine how upset they would be seeing the elected government removed from power in Kiev by Washington, with US senators literally on stage side by side with modern day Nazis, and putting anti-Russian extremists into power. Nazis, how might that make people in Crimea who identify as Russian feel? So anyway, the op-ed goes on and it says, meanwhile, although Ukraine's response to the invasion has been heroic and its military has performed brilliantly, the country's economy is in shambles, millions of its people have fled, its infrastructure is being destroyed, and much of its mineral wealth, industrial capacity, and considerable agricultural land are under Russian control. Ukraine's military capability and economy are now dependent almost entirely on lifelines from the West, primarily the United States, and that is a fact. The United States, above and beyond everyone else, even combined, has been contributing the most. Absent another major Ukrainian breakthrough and success against Russian forces, Western pressures on Ukraine to negotiate a ceasefire will grow as months of military stalemate pass. We're not in a stalemate anymore. We're actually watching Russia make gains on the battlefield. Under current circumstances, any negotiated ceasefire would leave Russian forces at a strong position to resume their invasion whenever they are ready. That is unacceptable. The only way to avoid such a scenario is for the United States and its allies to urgently provide Ukraine with a dramatic increase in military supplies and capabilities sufficient to deter a renewed Russian offensive and to enable Ukraine to push back Russian forces in the East and South. Then it says the U.S. agreement Thursday to provide Bradley fighting vehicles is commendable. So this is from a couple of weeks ago. If overdue, because there are serious logistical challenges associated with sending American Abrams heavy tanks, Germany and other allies should fill this need, as if Leopard 2 tanks are any more viable. They aren't. NATO members also should provide Ukrainians with longer range missiles, advanced drones, significant ammunition stocks, including artillery shells, more reconnaissance and surveillance capabilities, and other equipment. These capabilities are needed in weeks, not months. And yet, as I've explained, it takes years to incorporate all of this equipment. This is hand-waving. This is, I want to win this military conflict, but I don't know how military conflict works, and I'm just going to wave my hand and say, send them all of these things, as if it's as easy to send them all of this equipment as it is to just write about it in an op-ed in the Washington Post. These are very high-level U.S. representatives, former U.S. representatives. They should know better. And they talk about things like sending them significant ammunition stocks, including artillery shells. They don't exist. They don't exist. They will not exist. They're going to expand production. In several years' time, they will be making half of what Ukraine needs every single month. And that rate of fire is actually much lower than Russia's rate of fire. So it's not even going to give them half of what they need to be outgunned the way they are right now. So this is the reality versus all of this hand-waving they want to do to try to change this reality. And then it says, and this is how it ends, President Vladimir Zelensky's speech before Congress last month reminded us of Winston Churchill's plea in February 1941. Give us the tools and we'll finish the job. We agree with the Biden administration's determination to avoid direct confrontation with Russia. However, an emboldened Putin might not give us that choice. The way to avoid confrontation with Russia in the future is to help Ukraine push back the invader now. That is the lesson of history that should guide us. And it lends urgency to the actions that must be taken before it is too late. It already is too late. It is already too late. The only option, and unfortunately one this op-ed left on the table, is for NATO, the US and NATO, to fight Russia themselves, because Ukraine cannot win on their own. That is a fact. These people running Western foreign policy, these are people who are incapable of winning this current conflict, but they're also psychologically incapable of losing it. And all that leaves are terrible options. The option of NATO confronting Russia directly, intervening more directly and more openly in Ukraine. And then even if they do, there is no guarantee that they're going to achieve their aims of dividing and destroying Russia. And then if they do directly confront Russia in Ukraine, and Russia somehow gets the upper hand over them, then it really will be all the way to Berlin or Brussels. So I think they should think this through a little bit more. It doesn't really seem like much thinking is going on at all. And just remember that everything that the West is doing to Russia right now, they are also doing to China. They are also fighting a proxy war against China. In recent weeks, I've covered stories where US-backed militants, terrorists really, in southwest Pakistan attacked a train. I've talked about the history of these terrorists that the US backs, openly backs, how they have been killing Chinese engineers. And this is why the US is backing them, to kill Chinese engineers, to physically attack Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure in places like Pakistan. They made an attempt on the life of the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan. So this is an ongoing proxy war killing Chinese people and trying to kill Chinese people that is ongoing right now all around the globe. They are backing terrorists in Myanmar who are attacking Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, a Chinese pipeline. They've also attacked and destroyed factories. They've also attacked Chinese businesses in places like the Solomon Islands. This is what the US is doing to China all along its periphery. So exactly what the US has been doing to Russia that forced Russia to react in Ukraine, this is what they're doing to China. And China is really the wild card, because they have all of this immense political, economic, and industrial capacity just waiting to spring into action. They're already helping Russia circumvent these sanctions that the West has placed on Russia. And it just remains to be seen where else and how else support between China and Russia manifests itself. Now, Alexander Mercouris of the Duran, and the link to his video will be in the video description below. He was talking about a U.S. military leader talking about war with China by 2025. And we can look at this article from the Washington Post. Why is a U.S. general predicting war with China by 2025? And if you read through this article, the flashpoint is Taiwan. The U.S. is interested in Taiwan, and a lot of people, because the Western media has lied to them about this issue, believe that Taiwan is somehow some independent entity that China is bullying, when in reality, if you go to the U.S. State Department's official website, U.S. relations with Taiwan, if you scroll down, it says the United States has a long-standing one China policy. One China means there's only one China and Taiwan is part of it. So that is the U.S. admitting that Taiwan is part of China. It also says, we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. But importantly, we do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means. Now, if you're saying that you don't support Taiwan independence, you have a one China policy, meaning Taiwan is part of China, and it's only logic. If it's not independent, it means it's part of something else. What is it a part of? It's part of China, the People's Republic of China. Then this isn't a matter of internal political matters for China. It's none of America's business, just as it's none of China's business if there's some sort of dispute between the government of Texas and Washington, D.C. And if China interfered in some sort of dispute between the state of Texas and the U.S. government, federal government in Washington, D.C., and especially if it included providing military support to the state of Texas, that would be perceived as interference and also perhaps an act of war. Now, understanding that, and understanding that the State Department itself on its own website says that there's only one China, Taiwan is not independent, we don't support independence. This is what it says. The United States makes available defense articles and services as necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability and maintains our capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of Taiwan. So they're playing a double game. They recognize China's sovereignty over Taiwan, and at the same time, they're pouring weapons into Taiwan to encourage separatism. That's what they're doing. This is why China is reacting the way that it is. The fact that U.S. interference in China's internal political affairs regarding Taiwan, the fact that it has a military component, this is essentially the U.S. pushing for war, provoking China toward war. Now, Alexander of the Duran, when he was talking about this general and this prospect of war with China by 2025, he mentions how this is added incentive for China to make sure Russia prevails against the U.S. in Ukraine. And I'd like to add that the U.S. is talking about war with China by 2025, not because China is rushing to go to war by 2025. It's because China continues to grow and rise economically and also militarily. After 2025, there will be no ability for the U.S. to wage any kind of military conflict with China and have any prospect of winning. That's why they want to do it sooner rather than later. That's why Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan to provoke China. That's why they're flooding Taiwan with weapons, to provoke China. That's why they sail U.S. warships through the strait, to provoke China to get this war going at a time sooner rather than later, when the U.S. has a better prospect of possibly winning. That's what this is all about. So this is where we are right now. Ukraine is clearly losing. So the only options for the U.S. and their allies is to either intervene directly and openly or accept that this proxy war of theirs has failed, And they're also running out of time in regards to China encircling and containing China, and having the ability to use Taiwan as a trigger for a war they think they can win. Time is running out, and they're rushing to get all of these things done. And when you rush, you make many mistakes, and we see them making these mistakes. So we're at a very critical juncture. It's extremely important to inform people about what's really going on versus what we're being told is going on, to keep an eye on how this plays out, and whether Russia and China will be able to walk the US to a relatively peaceful collapse of its global empire and make this transition as painlessly as possible toward a US and a West that is a constructive member of a multipolar world, rather than this scorched earth policy they have, destroying everyone and everything, trying to cling to their unipolar world order. This attempt for them to compete against Russia and China by just destroying everything. They're destroying Ukraine. They are preparing to destroy Taiwan. So that does it for this update. If you thought it was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. There's also links to all of the resources that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to block it or skip it, because it's not helping me at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations, month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, getting this information out to people, helping inform people about what's going on, that all helps, and that is all greatly appreciated. So thank you again, and as always, thank you for watching.